The hush of anticipation rippled across Kensington Palace Gardens, cutting through the crisp London air like a thin blade. It was the kind of day that seemed to belong to another era, when carriages and horses graced these very grounds. But now, the old grandeur met the new world in a lavish display of wealth and pedigree. Crystal glasses clinked softly in manicured hands as the city's elite gathered beneath ornate awnings, the scent of imported cigars mixing with blooming roses from the palace gardens. Under the dazzling afternoon light, every detail, every tailored jacket, every gleaming cufflink seemed to sparkle as if competing for attention. Into this world of polish and privilege stepped Arthur Oldham, a man whose presence did not belong and whose story was not yet known. He appeared almost spectral at first, his coat a battered tweed relic from another lifetime, his gait deliberate, unhurried. Deep lines etched Arthur's face, and a long gray scarf clung to his shoulders, giving him the quiet dignity of someone who had survived more winters than he cared to count. The crowd parted just enough to let him through, not out of respect, but out of discomfort, their eyes darting from the faded hem of his coat to the sturdy old boots that seemed almost an affront to the marble underfoot. He could feel it, the curious glances, the stifled laughter, the thinly veiled contempt. In a sea of new money and inherited arrogance, Arthur was a living reminder that time does not wait for anyone, nor does it guarantee kindness. Across the pavilion, a flash of movement and laughter broke the tension. Edward Fairfax, all youth and swagger, raised his glass in a mock salute to his entourage, his laughter echoing across the garden. The sharp lines of his tailored suit cut a striking figure, and his gold watch gleamed as if it alone could buy half the horses in England. His friends hung on his every word, but Edward's eyes darted to Arthur with an amused, predatory gleam. The old man's presence was an oddity, and in Edward's world, oddities were meant to be ridiculed. Arthur ignored the stares, pressing on with a quiet resolve, each step toward the heart of the pavilion a small act of defiance. He paused only when he reached the centerpiece of the afternoon, the display enclosure where Windsor Star stood, tall and magnificent, his black coat gleaming in the filtered sunlight. The stallion's muscles rippled beneath his skin, and his eyes, deep and intelligent, watched the crowd with a mixture of pride and suspicion. This was no ordinary horse. This was royalty on four hooves, a living legend among the equestrian elite. For a moment, time seemed to slow as Arthur and Windsor Star regarded each other. To the casual onlooker, it was just a poor old man admiring an expensive horse, but beneath that surface, something much deeper stirred. Arthur's hand shook slightly as he reached into his inner pocket, pulling out a small, battered photograph, faded around the edges, creased from years of being handled with reverence. He gazed at the image, a beautiful mare, regal and gentle-eyed, standing proudly beside a much younger Arthur on the rolling hills of Ashdown Manor. Scrawled beneath the image, in a shaky hand were the words, "Queen's Grace." Arthur's gaze flickered from the photo to Windsor Star, his breath catching in his throat. Could it really be? He pressed the photo to his heart, his eyes stinging with memories of laughter echoing across green pastures, of days spent under the endless Cotswold sky, of a life that had once belonged to him but had been ripped away. He studied the program for the auction, his eyes scanning the lineage printed beneath Windsor Star's name. The words leapt off the page, "Son of Queen's Grace." Arthur's grip tightened on the photograph. It wasn't just a horse behind that gilded rope. It was the last living piece of a legacy that had been stolen from him, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had worked to reclaim. Behind him, the crowd murmured. Some smirked, others whispered, and Edward Fairfax, catching Arthur's gaze, flashed a mocking smile, his arm draped around a laughing companion. Arthur felt the heat rising in his cheeks, but kept his voice and posture steady. He moved closer to the enclosure, ignoring the warning glances of security. For a brief, impossible second, Windsor Star turned his massive head and fixed Arthur with a long, unblinking stare. The world seemed to fall away, no audience, no judgment, just an old man and the horse who carried the spirit of his past. Arthur exhaled slowly, tucking the photograph away. Determination settled into his bones, colder and sharper than the London breeze. He didn't belong here. They all wanted him to remember that. But he wasn't leaving. Not today. Not without a fight. As the first gavel was raised and the crowd drew tighter, Arthur stood his ground, heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and outrage. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, he could win it all back. The hum of anticipation had barely settled before Arthur took a hesitant step closer to the row of velvet ropes guarding Windsor Star's enclosure. His heart thudded with every footfall. Before he could get another look at the magnificent stallion, a hand landed firmly on his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir," a voice said, brisk but not unkind. Arthur turned to see a young man in a black suit, his badge glinting in the light. Oliver. Security. The boy couldn't have been more than 25. But the way he squared his shoulders betrayed the weight of responsibility. "This area is reserved for VIP guests only." Arthur hesitated, the retort lingering on his tongue. He glanced beyond Oliver, watching as wealthy men and women, with their silk scarves and glinting jewelry, mingled around the enclosure without interruption. A few of them noticed the interaction, lips curling in amusement or disdain. He took a slow breath, trying to steady his voice. "I only want a closer look at the horse. I assure you, I mean no trouble." Oliver's expression softened for an instant, but then a burst of laughter cut through the tension. Edward Fairfax, impossible to ignore, sauntered forward with a cluster of impeccably dressed companions trailing behind him. His gaze swept Arthur from head to toe, a smirk twisting his lips. "Lost, are you?" Edward's voice rang out, loud enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. "I believe the livestock auction is being held at Smithfield Market today, not here at Kensington Gardens." Laughter erupted from his friends. Arthur felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over him. His cheeks flushed as he tried to meet Edward's gaze, but the younger man's eyes sparkled with cruel delight. Oliver glanced nervously between Edward and Arthur, uncertain whether to intervene. Edward continued, turning to the onlookers with an exaggerated shrug. "Really, who let the riffraff in? You'd think with all the security, we'd be spared from distractions." The implication hung in the air. Arthur squared his shoulders, refusing to give Edward the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. He pressed his lips together, determined not to react. Not yet. A hush fell over the immediate crowd. Nearby, Sir Reginald Pembroke, silver-haired and regal, watched the scene with narrowed eyes from his seat beneath a striped canopy. Unlike the others, there was no malice in his gaze, only curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of recognition. His attention was fixed on something small and almost forgotten. The tie clip shaped like a horse's head that fastened Arthur's weathered scarf. For a fleeting moment, Reginald's eyes widened, memories stirring in their depths. Arthur turned away from Edward, letting the jeers wash over him. He tried to focus on Windsor Star, who, to Arthur's surprise, seemed equally aware of the tension. The stallion's ears flicked back and forth, his tail swishing restlessly. Arthur fished the battered photograph from his pocket again, his fingers trembling as he stroked its worn edges. The image of Queen's Grace, dignified and timeless, gave him the strength to stand his ground. A subtle shift in the air. Windsor Star, as if sensing something familiar, raised his head and fixed his gaze on Arthur. Their eyes met, and for an instant the crowd and the noise faded into nothingness. The horse snorted softly, stamping a hoof, a gesture so deliberate that a ripple of surprise ran through those closest to the pen. "Look at that. Seems even the horse thinks you're out of place, old man," one of Edward's friends sneered. But Arthur didn't move. He felt something pass between him and the stallion, a silent recognition, an understanding that transcended the decades and all the bitterness in between. He reached out slowly, his fingers hovering just above the rope. Windsor Star stretched his elegant neck toward him, nostrils flaring as if to catch a scent from the past. Sir Reginald leaned toward his assistant, voice low and urgent. "See that tie clip? That's the old Cotswolds Riding Club insignia. Only a handful of those were ever made." His assistant glanced up, curiosity piqued. "You think he's—" Reginald shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I know exactly who he is. Arthur Oldham, if I'm not mistaken. As Reginald's words faded into the murmur of the crowd, Arthur felt an odd sense of reassurance. There were still those who remembered, who could see beyond the worn coat and tired eyes to the man he had once been and might still be. Suddenly, Edward's laughter faded. He exchanged a sharp look with his friends, the initial amusement giving way to suspicion. "Come on, let's not waste any more time on the past. There's real business to attend to," he announced, though his voice lacked its earlier bravado. Arthur watched him stride away, but not before Edward shot him one last lingering glance, a mixture of contempt and, for the briefest moment, something that looked almost like fear. Arthur tucked the photograph away, turning his attention back to Windsor Star. The connection was still there, unspoken but powerful. He didn't belong in this world of silk and privilege, but here, in the shadow of a great horse and the memory of a life he had loved, Arthur found a reason to stand tall. He traced the faded outline of Queen's Grace with his thumb, whispering so only he and Windsor Star could hear. "I'm here for you," he murmured, "for all that was taken, for all that remains." At that moment, Oliver returned, his professional demeanor replaced with a touch of empathy. "Sir, if you'd like, you can stay on this side of the rope and watch. Just try to keep a low profile, okay? Some of these folks can be—" Arthur managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, son." The boy hesitated, then nodded, stepping back just enough to give Arthur a clear view. The crowd had begun to thin as the time for the auction drew closer. Conversations became hushed, the anticipation thickening as the main event loomed. From across the lawn, Sir Reginald stood and made his way toward Arthur, cane tapping rhythmically against the stone pathway. As he approached, Arthur noticed the kindness in the older man's eyes, a warmth that set him apart from the rest of the gathering. "Arthur Oldham, if I'm not mistaken," Reginald greeted, his voice both soft and commanding. Arthur looked up, surprised but wary. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir." Reginald smiled, extending his hand. "Reginald Pembroke. We met many years ago, back when Ashdown Manor was still the pride of the Cotswolds." Arthur took the offered hand, his grip strong despite the years. "A lifetime ago," he said quietly. Reginald glanced toward Windsor Star. "You never forget greatness, Mr. Oldham, especially when it's stolen from you." Arthur stiffened. For a moment he considered brushing off the comment, but something in Reginald's expression told him it was safe to be honest. "They think I don't belong here," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Queen's Grace was as much a part of my life as my own blood. That horse," he nodded at Windsor Star, "he's all I have left of her." Reginald nodded, his gaze distant. "You've come for more than just a memory, I take it?" Arthur's eyes hardened with resolve. "I intend to reclaim what's rightfully mine, one way or another." A hush fell over the area as the first chimes of the auction bell rang out. Servants moved through the crowd, ushering guests toward their seats beneath the grand marquee. Arthur and Reginald stood together for a moment longer, bound by the unspoken camaraderie of men who had both gained and lost everything. As Reginald moved to take his seat, Arthur felt the eyes of the crowd on him once more. This time, he met their gazes without flinching. He was no longer the outcast. He was a man on a mission, and his resolve burned brighter than the midday sun. The world of privilege and power had done its best to keep Arthur Oldham out, but as the doors to the auction tent opened, he stepped forward, unbowed. The battle for Windsor Star, and for everything he had ever loved, was only just beginning. The auction tent brimmed with a quiet, electric tension as the hour of decision approached. Plush red carpets muffled the footsteps of London's finest as they settled into gilt chairs, their hushed conversations floating beneath the chandeliers like restless ghosts. For most, this was just another display of power and wealth, a game played behind silk curtains and diamond cufflinks. But for Arthur Oldham, each tick of the ornate clock on the back wall was a reminder of how high the stakes had become. He moved with careful purpose through the tense entrance, the memory of Edward's public humiliation still lingering in the air behind him. As Arthur took his seat at the very edge of the VIP section, he could feel eyes upon him, some lingering in curiosity, others flickering with open disdain. In his lap, the battered auction catalog trembled ever so slightly in his hands. Arthur's gaze went first to the list of featured horses, tracing each name as if he were searching for something lost and precious. But his attention quickly focused on the entry for Windsor Star. He read the details over and over, as if repetition could somehow make them more real. Windsor Star, Black Stallion, 5 years old. Sire. Champion's Glory. Damn. Queen's Grace. His heart stumbled at the name. In that moment, he could almost hear Queen's Grace calling to him across the years, a soft nicker in the early morning mist, the stamp of her hoof on dew-soaked grass. It wasn't just memory. It was blood calling to blood. His thumb hovered over a footnote, a line so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Windsor Star, son of Queen's Grace, direct descendant of the Ashdown line, last of the legendary bloodline believed lost. Arthur's throat tightened. The last. They had taken everything from him all those years ago, his home, his pride, his very purpose. But fate, or perhaps something greater, had delivered this chance for redemption. He felt his pulse quicken. It was more than a horse. It was hope, legacy, family. Across the tent, Edward Fairfax reclined with feigned ease among a circle of investors, men in sharp suits, their voices oozing confidence and greed. At Edward's elbow, Mr. Langley, a shrewd man with cold blue eyes, whispered, "It's simple, Edward. Drive up the price, let the rabble fall away. Windsor Star is ours, and the world will know it." Edward smirked. "No one's going to challenge us, not with the money we've pooled, and certainly not that old ghost wandering about. He can barely afford the tea service." They laughed. The sound grated on Arthur's nerves, but he kept his focus, straining to hear every detail. Edward's companions were too careless, too certain of their victory. Arthur's lips pressed into a determined line. They didn't know what he'd been through. They didn't know what a man could accomplish when he had nothing left to lose. He flipped open his ancient cell phone, the keys worn smooth by years of anxious dialing. With practiced secrecy, he pressed the speed dial for George Bell, his loyal friend and the last remnant of the life he had built at Ashdown Manor. "George, all set?" Arthur whispered, voice rough with anticipation. The reply came with unwavering steadiness. "Yes, sir. Barclays called this morning. The funds have cleared. Everything is ready at Ashdown. All that's left is your word?" Arthur felt a wave of relief, but also a fresh surge of nerves. "Thank you, George. No matter what happens, thank you." He could almost hear George smile. "You'll bring him home, Mr. Oldham. I know you will." Arthur ended the call, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. The doubts gnawed at him. Was it madness to gamble everything on one last chance? He looked down at his hands, trembling just a little, and forced himself to steady them. He had survived worse. The noise of the tent faded for a moment, and Arthur's mind drifted backward to fields golden in the Cotswolds sun, Queen's Grace racing like a shadow across the hills, Arthur's younger self laughing with a freedom he had not felt in decades. The memory pressed at his heart, sharp with longing and regret. A familiar voice broke his reverie. "Mr. Oldham, I presume?" Arthur turned to see Sir Reginald Pembroke at his side. His cane looped over his arm. The old man's eyes gleamed with a mixture of mischief and empathy. "You recognize me, Sir Reginald?" Arthur asked, his voice soft but clear. "I do," Reginald replied, settling into the chair beside Arthur. "It's not every day you see the Cotswolds' finest horsemen back in the fray." Arthur couldn't help a small, wry smile. "I'm afraid I don't look the part anymore." Reginald glanced at Arthur's threadbare coat, the battered auction catalog in his lap. You look exactly as you should, my friend. If half the men here had your heart, this world would be a better place. Arthur's eyes misted for a moment. He cleared his throat. I need your advice. These men, Edward, his investors, they're plotting to inflate the price, freeze out anyone who stands against them. I can't match their fortunes, but... Reginald leaned in. You have something they'll never understand, Arthur. Conviction. Sometimes that's worth more than all the gold in London. Just remember, don't let them see your desperation. Let them think you're unshakable. Arthur nodded, clutching the photograph of Queen's Grace inside his coat for luck. Thank you, Reginald. Truly. As the auctioneer's gavel struck the podium, a hush swept through the tent. Mr. Henry Beebe, commanding in his crisp suit, took the stage. The spotlights gleamed on his silver hair, and the excitement in his voice was palpable. Ladies and gentlemen, we come now to the centerpiece of today's auction, the peerless Windsor Star, direct heir to the fabled Queen's Grace, and some say the future of British racing. The handlers led Windsor Star into the ring. Even among the city's wealthiest, the horse's presence was spellbinding. He tossed his head, the light shimmering along his black mane, every muscle rippling with power. Arthur sat forward in his seat, breath held tight in his chest. Mr. Beebe launched into a litany of achievements and bloodlines, his words slicing through the crowd's restlessness. Shall we open the bidding at £50,000? A hand shot up almost immediately from the Fairfax camp. 50,000, called Edward, voice loud and eager. His investors joined in rapid succession, 60, 80, £100,000. Arthur felt the pressure mounting, the familiar fear threatening to drown his resolve. He watched the numbers climb, the hands rising with practiced ease, and knew this was the game they had prepared for. But he steeled himself, refusing to show even a flicker of doubt. As the bids soared past 120,000, Arthur noticed Edward glancing his way, eyes filled with smug satisfaction. This is too easy, Edward whispered to Langley. No one's going to challenge us. Arthur's jaw clenched. Not yet. The auctioneer's cadence was relentless. 160, 180, £200,000. Do I have 220? The tent buzzed with excitement and tension. It was clear that everyone, from the most jaded investor to the old guard seated at the back, sensed that this was more than just another sale. Edward raised his hand again, a flourish for his audience. 250,000. Arthur gripped the edge of his seat, feeling his heart hammer in his chest. His moment was coming. He forced himself to wait, to let the arrogance of youth drive the price just a bit higher. As the gavel hovered, Mr. Beebe's eyes swept the tent. Any further bids? Edward, believing his victory assured, leaned back in his chair with a self-satisfied grin. The room quieted. Arthur took one last look at the photo in his coat, at Windsor Star, at the shimmering ghosts of the past. He raised his hand. £300,000, Arthur called out, his voice steady and clear, slicing through the silence. A wave of shock swept the tent. Heads turned, whispers erupted, and Edward's smug expression faltered, surprise flickering across his face. He recovered quickly, standing up as if to reassert dominance. 350,000, Edward shot back, his tone harder, the easy confidence beginning to crack. Arthur met his gaze without blinking. 400,000. Now the tent was fully alive with excitement and disbelief. People leaned forward, sensing a battle that transcended money. Edward's hands balled into fists. 450,000, he blurted. Arthur didn't hesitate. £500,000. The words hung in the air like thunder, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Even Mr. Beebe seemed taken aback. The silence deepened until, slowly, all eyes in the room locked on Arthur. Some were incredulous, some amused, some simply awestruck. Edward's mouth worked soundlessly. He seemed for the first time to truly see the man before him, not a relic, not a joke, but a force to be reckoned with. Langley hissed in his ear, "Back down. No horse is worth that much." But Edward's pride, stoked by years of unchallenged privilege, would not allow retreat. He glared at Arthur, voice tight and trembling. But Mr. Beebe interrupted, his voice rich with drama. Do I hear 550,000, 500,000 going once, going twice? Edward's mouth snapped shut. For the briefest instant, Arthur saw not a spoiled child, but a frightened boy, desperate to live up to a legacy that was never truly his. Sold, Mr. Beebe cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. To Arthur Oldham. A surge of relief, disbelief, and something very close to triumph swept through Arthur. He looked down at his hands, barely able to believe what he had done. Around him the crowd erupted, some in applause, some in stunned silence, and some in grumbling disbelief. Windsor Star pawed at the sawdust floor, tossing his mane as if he understood what had just happened. Arthur's chest swelled with pride. For the first time in decades, he felt whole. But as Edward stormed from the tent, his face white with shock and rage, Arthur knew the battle was far from over. What had been reclaimed in public would still need to be defended in private, and there were debts, secrets, and wounds that money alone could never heal. Yet for now, in this moment, under the high, white ceiling of the auction tent, Arthur allowed himself a single, trembling smile. The past was not dead. It had come home, at last. The atmosphere in the auction tent was nearly suffocating as the crescendo of excitement peaked, then trembled on the edge of silence. Arthur's final bid of £500,000 seemed to echo in every corner, rebounding off velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers, rippling through the hearts of the wealthy and the world-weary alike. Edward Fairfax, usually the master of ceremonies in his own universe, was left standing, eyes wide and jaw slack, as the name Arthur Oldham resounded in the wake of the gavel's decisive crack. But in that breathless pause, before the crowd erupted, there came a moment of raw tension, where history seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Henry Beebe, master auctioneer, peered over his spectacles in disbelief, double-checking his bidder's roster as if to ensure he hadn't misheard. Then he offered a crisp, theatrical bow. Sold at £500,000 to Mr. Arthur Oldham. Instantly, a wave of sound crashed through the tent. Some clapped, others simply shook their heads, muttering about madness or legends come to life. But Arthur was only aware of the roaring in his own ears and the sight of Windsor Star tossing his proud head under the lights, as if the stallion, too, sensed the shifting tides of fate. Edward, flushed with embarrassment and rage, fought to regain his composure. He squared his shoulders, stormed forward with forced bravado, and raised his voice so all could hear. I protest. I demand that this man, prove he can pay what he's bid. This is a prestigious event, not a charity case. How do we know he isn't wasting everyone's time? The venom in his tone sent a ripple through the audience. Investors and socialites turned in their seats, suddenly eager for a different kind of spectacle, the kind where the mighty might be brought low, or perhaps the underdog proven a fraud. Arthur, meanwhile, stood quietly, his face an impassive mask, though inside his nerves quaked. Mr. Beebe, to his credit, maintained the dignity of the proceedings. We require confirmation from all winning bidders, he said, voice level. Mr. Oldham, may I? Arthur nodded and reached for his wallet, a battered old thing, its leather edges worn from decades of honest work. He pulled out a single, folded check, the colors and stamp of Barclays Private Bank, clearly visible even from several feet away. The crowd craned their necks to see, eager for some drama, whether triumph or humiliation. With calm precision, Arthur handed the check to Mr. Beebe. The auctioneer signaled for his assistant, who produced a portable phone. The seconds ticked by painfully as they dialed, the line connecting to the private banking desk. Each second seemed to stretch into eternity. The tension was thick enough to taste. All eyes were on Arthur, and all Arthur could do was wait, outwardly composed, though inside every memory of defeat, of nights spent counting shillings, of loss, whispered that it could all slip away in a moment. Across the tent, Sir Reginald Pembroke watched intently. He alone seemed to understand the weight behind Arthur's calm, his eyes alight with a blend of hope and old camaraderie. Edward stood rigid, his lips pulled thin, knuckles white on the back of a chair. Finally, the assistant spoke softly into Mr. Beebe's ear. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose with surprise, and then he smiled, a genuine, almost boyish smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Beebe announced, "I have just received confirmation from Barclays Private Bank. Mr. Oldham's funds are secure and his check is valid. He is indeed the rightful winner of Windsor Star." Applause erupted louder than before, part shock, part admiration, part pure British love of an upset. Sir Reginald stood and offered a small, approving nod to Arthur. For his part, Arthur let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. At his side, the photograph of Queen's Grace pressed against his chest, as if lending him strength for the next storm. Edward, however, was not so easily silenced. His face contorted with frustration, he called out, "Ashdown. He mentioned Ashdown. What does that mean? My father bought that estate, fair and square. Who does this man think he is?" It was Sir Reginald who answered, his voice carrying effortlessly. Ashdown Manor was the heart of English horsemanship for decades, until it was stripped away through legal trickery and ambition. Arthur Oldham is not just a name. He is the soul of Ashdown, the keeper of Queen's Grace's line, and the reason that horse stands in this ring today. A hush fell over the room. The wealthy and powerful, for once, seemed uncertain of their footing. Arthur's story, one of pride, loss, and undimmed resolve, had cut through the glittering artifice of their world. Even Edward, for all his arrogance, faltered. Arthur met Edward's gaze, his voice steady but edged with the steel of hard memory. "Windsor Star isn't a stranger to me. Queen's Grace, his mother, was my life's pride. Ashdown Manor was my home, until your father's lawyers made sure it was not." A ripple ran through the audience. The clash between old money and new, between those who inherited and those who earned, was suddenly made real. No longer a dinner party debate, but a living drama. Arthur's hands, so steady as he raised his bid, now curled tightly at his sides. Edward's voice, now quieter, held a tremor. "You can't expect us to give up what's rightfully ours." Sir Reginald's voice cut him off, more forceful than before. "It was never rightfully yours, Edward. Some things can't be bought or stolen. They have to be earned through sweat, honor, and heart." The drama reached its peak as Mr. Beebe, intent on restoring order, rapped the gavel again. "Gentlemen, this is not the place for family disputes. The sale is concluded. Windsor Star belongs to Mr. Oldham. Please conduct yourselves with dignity." With that, the tension snapped, and the normal bustle of the auction resumed. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Arthur stood taller, not simply because he had won the horse, but because at last he had faced down the ghosts of his past and been found worthy. As the crowd began to disperse, Arthur caught sight of Windsor Star being led from the ring by the handlers. The stallion resisted at first, tossing his head and pawing at the ground. Then, as Arthur approached, the horse's demeanor changed. Windsor Star's ears pricked forward, and he stepped willingly toward the old man, nostrils flaring as if recognizing a scent from a half-remembered dream. Arthur reached out, resting a trembling hand on the stallion's sleek neck. For a moment, all the noise of the tent faded away. There was only the warmth of living muscle, the steady beat of a heart beneath his palm, and a silent promise of homecoming, of restoration, of legacy not lost, but found again. From the corner of his eye, Arthur saw Edward watching, shoulders sagging, pride wounded. The young man's bravado had melted into something rawer, more human, a deep and unfamiliar sense of failure. Arthur almost pitied him, knowing all too well the sting of loss. Sir Reginald joined Arthur at the rail. "Well done, old friend. I always hoped you'd get your day." Arthur managed a weary smile. "It's not over yet. There's still a long road home." Reginald chuckled. "You'll make it. You always do." Across the room, George Bell appeared, discreet but unmistakable. He nodded to Arthur, signaling that all arrangements were complete. The truck was ready, the papers were signed, and Ashdown Manor, rebuilt, restored, waiting, would soon welcome home its prodigal son and the living legacy of Queen's grace. Arthur glanced once more at the glittering world of Kensington Palace Gardens. He felt neither envy nor regret. He had played their game and won, but it was not their approval he craved. It was the simple satisfaction of doing what was right, of proving, if only to himself, that some things are worth any sacrifice. As the last rays of late afternoon sun angled through the tent, Arthur took Windsor Star's lead and began the slow walk to freedom. Each step felt lighter, as if the burdens of the past, betrayal, poverty, exile, were falling away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable pride. The crowd watched them go, some in admiration, some in disbelief, and some in silent reflection, perhaps wondering what they themselves might fight for, if they ever found something worth loving, as much as Arthur loved Ashdown, Queen's grace, and the life that now waited for him beyond the city's gilded walls. Outside the tent, the world was changing. The lights of London sparkled against a deepening sky. Arthur paused, looking back only once, then pressed forward, the future opening ahead like the endless Cotswold fields of his youth. He did not know all the challenges that lay ahead. Rebuilding trust, reclaiming the respect of his peers, healing the wounds that money alone could not touch. But for the first time in years, he dared to hope. As Windsor Star wickered softly at his side, Arthur reached into his pocket for the photo of Queen's grace. He gazed at it for a moment, then slipped it back inside his coat, the memory now carried not as a weight, but as a light to guide him home. And as they stepped out into the cool evening, the city behind, and the promise of Ashdown ahead, Arthur Oldham allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile. The battle for his legacy was not yet over, but for the first time in decades, he was ready for whatever might come. The weight of victory pressed heavily on Arthur's shoulders as he led Windsor Star away from the auction tent, the approving murmurs of the crowd still echoing in his ears. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed as if the world was in balance again, that honor and hard work had finally been rewarded after years of darkness. But Arthur knew all too well that every triumph in life invited new challenges. He could already feel the storm brewing behind him in the form of Edward Fairfax's wounded pride and the scrutiny of the city's high society. As he made his way through the narrow path between the trimmed hedges and the parked luxury cars outside Kensington Palace Gardens, Arthur tried to focus on the steady, rhythmic clop of Windsor Star's hooves. Each step was a reminder that this wasn't just a horse. It was a living, breathing piece of his soul restored. Still, every few paces he felt the sting of a dozen watchful eyes tracking him from the shadows, their curiosity laced with doubt. Suddenly, a voice cut through the gentle murmur of the garden. "Mr. Oldham, one moment, please." It was Mr. Beebe, the auctioneer, hurrying after him with a clipboard in hand. Arthur paused, turning to face him, keeping one reassuring hand on Windsor Star's halter. "I do apologize for the delay, sir, but there are a few last formalities regarding the transfer." "And, well," Mr. Beebe hesitated, dropping his voice, "it appears that Mr. Fairfax has issued a formal protest regarding your ability to complete the purchase. I am, of course, already satisfied, but given his family's influence, we must follow the rules and verify again with the bank, just as a formality." Arthur's jaw tightened, but he managed a calm nod. "Of course. I have nothing to hide." While Mr. Beebe bustled away to make the final phone call, the pause allowed the press and onlookers to close in. Reporters, sensing a juicy story, fallen aristocrat reclaims legacy, hovered with cameras, eager for a quote or a photograph. Arthur did his best to ignore them, focusing on the gentle rise and fall of Windsor Star's breath. Just then, Edward Fairfax strode forward, his eyes flashing with indignation. He was alone now, his friends hanging back at the garden's edge, not wanting to be pulled into what promised to be a public confrontation. Arthur saw in Edward's posture the desperation of someone who had never truly faced defeat. The young man's face was flushed, his fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," Edward hissed, voice trembling between anger and disbelief. You think you can just walk back into our world and take what you want? My father, he built everything we have. Ashdown is ours. That horse, he jabbed a finger at Windsor Star, should have been ours too. Arthur regarded him steadily. No one builds anything on deceit, Edward. Sooner or later, the truth finds its way back. Edward bristled. You old men and your fairy tales. But Arthur cut him off, his own voice hard and cold. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a reckoning. I didn't come here for revenge, but I won't let the sins of your father dictate my life any longer. The exchange drew the attention of several bystanders. Whispers swept through the crowd, some sympathetic, others simply savoring the drama. Mr. Beebe returned just then, holding the phone away from his ear. All is in order, Mr. Oldham. The payment has been verified a second time. Congratulations. Again. Edward turned, a shade paler, his bravado flickering. This is a mistake. It must be. Sir Reginald Pembroke, who had quietly joined the gathering, raised his cane and spoke with measured authority. Edward, sometimes it's better to accept the outcome with grace than to prolong your own humiliation. For a long, silent moment, Edward stared at Arthur, searching his face for some sign of weakness. Instead, he found only quiet resolve. With a defeated shake of his head, he turned and disappeared into the growing shadows of the garden, leaving the crowd to dissipate and the story to settle in the night air. Arthur let out a slow breath. The hardest part, perhaps, was not confronting Edward's anger, but confronting the doubts of the people who had once known him only by rumor and reputation. Even as he signed the last of the transfer documents and shook hands with Mr. Beebe, he felt the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Could he truly reclaim his legacy? Did Ashdown still have a place for him, or had time washed everything away? George Bell appeared at his side, sturdy and reassuring as ever. Truck's waiting at the main entrance, Arthur. Everything's packed for the journey. I even found that old halter you used for Queen's Grace. Figured Windsor Star might appreciate the history. Arthur's lips curled into a weary smile. Thank you, George, for everything. As they walked together to the waiting transport, Arthur caught Windsor Star's gaze. The stallion seemed to sense his mood, head held high, but ears flicking forward as if to say, I remember you too. Arthur stroked his neck, feeling a deep connection that transcended years and words. Loading Windsor Star into the trailer was an unexpectedly smooth affair. The horse walked in with little hesitation, pausing only once to look back at Arthur, as if to reassure himself that the man would not disappear again. With George driving and Arthur settled in the passenger seat, the city lights of London soon faded behind them. But even as the rhythm of the road took over, Arthur's mind churned with restless energy. He replayed every moment of the auction, every word spoken by Edward and Reginald, every look from the crowd. The journey ahead felt both triumphant and uncertain. Would Ashdown Manor welcome him home, or would it, too, hold the scars of betrayal and loss? The silence in the cab was broken only by the hum of the tires on the highway and George's quiet, reassuring presence. At last, unable to contain the weight of it any longer, Arthur spoke. Did you ever think we'd come back like this, George? After all the years? George kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was warm. Always believed you would, Arthur. You never gave up, not really. The world tried to beat you down, but you're still here. Arthur nodded, but his thoughts were less certain. It's not the same. Ashdown, it's been someone else's for so long. I'm not sure what I'll find when we get there. You'll find what you always had, George replied. Heart, family, maybe a few ghosts. But you'll make it yours again. You and that horse, just like old times. As the miles slipped by and the city gave way to rolling countryside, Arthur allowed himself, for the first time in years, to dream of home. He pictured the long, winding drive, lined with chestnut trees, the crumbling stone walls covered in ivy, the wide green fields where Queen's Grace once ran wild and free. He wondered if the air would still carry the same sweet scent of grass and earth if the morning sun would rise golden over the hills, as it always had. Windsor Star shifted in the trailer behind them, as if sensing the approach of something monumental. Arthur smiled softly. No matter what waited at Ashdown, he would face it head on. He owed it to Queen's Grace, to Windsor Star, to himself. As they neared the outskirts of the Cotswolds, the sky blushed with the last light of evening. George guided the truck up the familiar lane, the silhouette of Ashdown Manor rising on the horizon, sturdy and dignified against the gathering dusk. Arthur's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the anticipation of stepping back into the life that had always been his, even when it was lost. When the gates swung open and the truck rumbled up the drive, Arthur caught his first true glimpse of home. The manor had changed. Restored, perhaps, but still bearing the marks of time. Yet the spirit of the place, the memory of all that had been and could be again, was unmistakable. As George parked and jumped down to open the trailer, Arthur paused, hand resting on the door handle. For a moment he allowed himself to be still, to breathe in the cool country air and listen to the quiet promise of the night. "Welcome home, sir," George said softly. Arthur nodded, eyes misty. "It's good to be back." Together, they led Windsor Star out into the darkness, the horses' hooves echoing on the cobblestones. With every step, the past fell away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable hope. Ashdown was his again, not just the land or the house, but the dream that had carried him through the hardest years of his life. For Arthur Oldham, the battle was not over, but tonight, as he stood under the wide Cotswold sky with Windsor Star at his side, it felt as though, for the first time in decades, he was truly, finally, home. Ashdown Manor emerged from the soft embrace of night like a memory refusing to fade, a silhouette of stone and slate against the rising moon. For Arthur, every inch of the winding driveway was thick with ghosts, laughter echoing from days when the stables bustled with energy, the musical ring of horseshoes, the distant sound of Queen's Grace running wild in the high meadow. Now, as he and George led Windsor Star down the gravel path, each step felt weighted with both the ache of the past and the hope of a new beginning. The house itself had changed. Where once the windows were broken and the gardens choked with weeds, now flower beds lined the walk, and the warm golden glow of restored lights shone through fresh glass. George, ever the steady hand, guided Windsor Star with gentle firmness, speaking softly to the horse, as if reassuring him that the land remembered and forgave. Arthur paused at the entry, the heavy wooden doors looming before him. He reached out, brushing his fingers over the iron latch, recalling all the times he'd come home, pockets empty, but heart full, to find Queen's Grace waiting in the yard or George bustling about with a kind word and a cup of tea. He wondered if it could ever feel the same. Inside, the manor was transformed. The grand hall gleamed, the portraits of Oldham's past dusted and straightened. A fire crackled in the hearth. George set about tending to Windsor Star, leading him to a stall that had once belonged to Queen's Grace, a place of honor now restored for her legacy. Arthur lingered at the threshold of the stable, eyes adjusting to the familiar shadows. Windsor Star turned, nostrils flaring, his gaze following Arthur with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, a recognition, as if the horse understood that this was not merely a homecoming, but a return of something sacred. "You remember, don't you, boy?" Arthur whispered. "This was her place, your mother's. You're home now." Windsor Star bobbed his head, a soft wicker vibrating in the quiet air. Arthur stroked his velvety muzzle, letting the memories flow. For a long time, he simply stood there, grounded in the present but drifting through recollections. A young man riding at dawn, a beautiful mare shining silver in the morning mist, laughter, promise, hope. It would have been easy to linger in nostalgia, but there was work to be done. As George returned to check on the horse, Arthur moved to his old study. There, he found a stack of letters and papers left by the estate's caretaker, legal forms, accounts, a letter from the bank confirming the successful transfer of funds, but among them was another letter, sealed in an envelope marked with an unfamiliar crest. Arthur's brow furrowed. He broke the seal, unfolding the heavy parchment. The message inside was brief and pointed. Mr. Oldham, congratulations on your successful acquisition of Windsor Star and your return to Ashdown. However, I must inform you that the Fairfax family has lodged an official complaint regarding the transfer of Ashdown Manor's title. They allege improprieties in the sale 20 years ago and are seeking to reopen legal proceedings. You are advised to secure representation and prepare for a potential challenge. Respectfully, Andrew C. Holt, ESQ. Holt and Partners. Solicitors. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. Even here, in the heart of what was once his sanctuary, the past would not yield so easily. He clenched the letter in his fist, his mind spinning with questions and doubts. Had he come all this way only to lose everything again? Was Edward truly so bent on revenge that he'd risk dragging both their families through public scandal? George found him standing by the window, the letter trembling in his hands. "Trouble, sir?" Arthur handed him the note, his voice low. "The Fairfaxes are challenging the title. Legal threats, again." George read it quickly, his face hardening with resolve. "Let them try. We did everything by the book. They're just sore losers." Arthur managed a tired smile, but his heart was heavy. "I wish I could believe it would be that simple, George. Men like the Fairfaxes don't fight fair." He paced the room, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his boots grounding him as he considered his next move. The thought of returning to courtrooms, of facing another round of humiliation and accusation, threatened to sap his spirit. Yet as he glanced outside, seeing Windsor Star quietly grazing beneath the stars, a sense of responsibility bloomed in his chest. He could not, would not, allow the past to repeat itself. That night, sleep came in fragments. Arthur dreamt of running through fields with Queen's Grace at his side, only to have the vision dissolve into a courtroom filled with sneering faces and echoing laughter. He woke before dawn, sweat on his brow, resolve settling in like armor. By the time the sun broke over the Cotswold hills, Arthur was already in the stable, brushing Windsor Star's coat, speaking to him as if the horse were his own flesh and blood. "No matter what happens, you belong here. This is your home, just as it was your mother's. They can't take that away. Not really." George entered with a mug of coffee and a determined glint in his eye. "There's an old friend you should call, Sir Reginald Pembroke. He's seen more courtrooms than most, and he knows how to handle men like the Fairfaxes." Arthur nodded. "You're right. I'll call him after breakfast." As the morning unfolded, the household slowly awakened, new staff moving through the halls with quiet efficiency. It was clear that George, anticipating this day, had made sure Ashdown was ready for its true master. The old friends shared a simple meal in the kitchen: eggs, bread, strong tea. Arthur found himself laughing more than he had in years, even as the shadow of the Fairfax threat hung overhead. He made the call to Sir Reginald just after 9. The older man answered on the first ring, his tone brisk and businesslike. "Arthur, I was hoping to hear from you. I saw the news. Edward's causing trouble, I gather." Arthur explained the situation, the threat of legal action, the weight pressing on his shoulders. Reginald listened in silence, then replied, "Don't let them rattle you. Their case is weak. They had their chance and lost. I know a solicitor who eats men like Fairfax for breakfast. I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow." Relief washed over Arthur. "Thank you, Reginald. I don't know if I could face this alone." "You're not alone, Arthur. You never were, and you're not the only one with a legacy to defend. Hold your head high." As he hung up, Arthur felt a new strength gathering within him. For too long he had let the world decide his fate. But now he was ready to fight. Not just for himself, but for all those who believed in Ashdown, in Queen's Grace, in the unbroken line that was their true inheritance. That afternoon, as he walked the fields with Windsor Star trotting at his side, Arthur was greeted by neighbors he hadn't seen in years. Some welcomed him warmly, others with wary curiosity, but all agreed that Ashdown felt alive again, as if the land itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. he found himself invited to the village for a small gathering that evening, a tradition long ago abandoned during the years of neglect. There, over pints of bitter and laughter shared beneath the low beams of the local pub, Arthur realized what he had reclaimed was more than property or prestige. It was the right to belong, to be part of a living story that would outlast him. As dusk deepened and the stars brightened, Arthur returned to Ashdown, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. Windsor Star greeted him with a nicker, and Arthur stroked his mane, whispering, "We're home, boy, and we're not giving it up without a fight." In the days that followed, as legal threats turned to letters and rumors began to swirl through the countryside, Arthur stood firm. He met with Reginald's solicitor, gathered his papers, and found strength in every sunrise over the fields, in every gentle nudge from Windsor Star, in every smile from George. No matter what the Fairfaxes tried, no matter how the winds of fortune blew, Arthur Oldham had already won something greater than any court could take away: the unbreakable bond between land, horse, and the heart that had never truly left home. And as another night settled over Ashdown, the manor alive with light and hope once more, Arthur knew that, come what may, the legacy of Queen's grace and of those who loved her would endure. Arthur's days at Ashdown blurred into a relentless rhythm of work, worry, and the ever-present specter of the Fairfax family's looming legal threat. Though the manor was alive with the colors of summer and the gentle sounds of a horse's contented whinny, tension never left his shoulders. Every morning brought another letter, another warning from Edward's lawyers, each more aggressive than the last. The local gossip mill spun ever faster. Some cheered Arthur's return. Others wondered if the past would simply repeat, with Ashdown snatched away once again by those with deeper pockets and sharper lawyers. Yet it was in these crucibles of uncertainty that Arthur found a new resolve, hard-edged, honed by loss, but lit by the quiet hope that had always defined the best of Ashdown. He would not run again. Not from Edward, not from the Fairfaxes, not from the wounds that time had left on his heart. Instead, he pressed forward, stubborn as the Cotswold stones, unyielding as the bloodline that now nickered to him each morning from Queen's Grace's old stall. Sir Reginald Pembroke's solicitor, Mrs. Davenport, soon became a fixture at the manor. She was a brisk, sharp-eyed woman with a knack for slicing through legal threats like a scythe through tall grass. The first time she met Arthur, she arrived with an armload of files and a cup of bitter coffee, her voice precise and unsentimental. "We'll meet them head-on, Mr. Oldham. They have bluster, not substance. As long as you hold your ground, Ashdown will stay yours." Arthur nodded, feeling a quiet gratitude beneath his anxiety. Each day, he spent hours combing through old papers, contracts, and bank ledgers, ensuring every stone was unturned. George handled the daily needs of Windsor Star and the house, often pausing to bring Arthur tea or force him out for a breath of fresh air in the paddock. But the world did not wait for Arthur to find his footing. Within a week, the Fairfaxes escalated the matter, not only with new lawyers but with a very public campaign. Press releases, rumors of fraud, stories about the unfit old man now running Ashdown. Edward in particular seemed to be everywhere, at local gatherings, on the phone with influential villagers, even in the pages of the local newspaper, insisting that Ashdown was still rightfully his family's and that Arthur had taken advantage of legal loopholes. It all came to a head one brisk morning when Arthur was summoned to an emergency meeting at the Cotswold District Court. He arrived in his best, though still modest, suit, George at his side, Mrs. Davenport carrying 2 briefcases filled with evidence and correspondences. The village square buzzed with speculation as they entered the courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with rivalry and unspoken grudges. Edward was already there, seated beside his father's old lawyer, Mr. Pritchard, a man who seemed carved out of stone, his face blank and his hands clutching an expensive pen. Edward's eyes flashed with a cocktail of anger, desperation, and something like fear. The judge, an old woman with a formidable reputation for fairness, called the room to order. The proceedings began with Edward's side presenting their grievances, allegations of fraud, claims that Arthur's purchase of Ashdown had been illegitimate, accusations of financial instability and emotional instability as well. Mrs. Davenport countered each with steely efficiency. All funds were verified, all documents properly executed, and Mr. Oldham's reputation, both as a horseman and a citizen, remains unblemished, despite what opposing counsel may wish the court to believe. She presented bank receipts, testimony from George, and records dating back to Arthur's original ownership. Edward's lawyer pressed hard, but the cracks in their case soon began to show. The judge questioned every detail, forcing Edward to admit under oath that he'd been unaware of many of the so-called irregularities until recently. When asked directly if he had any evidence that Arthur had acted in bad faith, Edward stammered, unable to provide anything beyond wounded pride and family legend. At a critical point, Sir Reginald Pembroke himself took the stand, called as a character witness. Arthur Oldham, he declared, is not only the rightful heir to Ashdown, but a man whose integrity has never wavered. If the Fairfaxes have any true claim, let them present it. Otherwise, let this village have its peace, and let Ashdown's horses run free again. The room quieted as the judge made her closing remarks, her tone both firm and compassionate. This court finds no evidence of fraud, no grounds to overturn the sale of Ashdown, and no reason to further harass Mr. Oldham. The matter is settled, now and for the foreseeable future. Arthur sat in stunned relief as the gavel struck. For the first time, he allowed himself a real, unguarded smile. George clapped him on the back, tears in his eyes. Even Mrs. Davenport, normally unflappable, offered a rare, small grin. But outside, under the heavy sky, Edward confronted Arthur, fury and grief mixing in his voice. "You think you've won, don't you? You took my father's legacy. You made me a laughing stock." Arthur met his gaze, his own voice trembling with years of hurt. "Your father took everything from me, Edward. My home, my future, my family's honor. But I never wanted revenge. I just wanted to set things right. Maybe it's time you stopped fighting ghosts and started building your own legacy." Edward looked away, the bravado draining from him. I only wanted to prove myself," he whispered. Arthur stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Proving yourself doesn't come from taking what isn't yours. It comes from doing what's right, even when it hurts." For a moment, the two men simply stood there, years of animosity and misunderstanding stretching between them. Then Edward, shoulders hunched, walked away into the uncertain future, leaving Arthur to his peace. The victory was not only legal, but deeply personal. That evening, the villagers gathered at Ashdown, bringing with them laughter, stories, and memories. Children raced through the fields, their voices carrying far into the dusk. George stoked a bonfire, and neighbors brought food and drink as if to baptize the manor and community once more. Arthur moved through the crowd in a kind of daze, receiving handshakes, hugs, and warm wishes. Some old friends apologized for having doubted him. Others simply welcomed him home. At the edge of the firelight, Sir Reginald found him and handed him a glass of dark, aged whiskey. "To new beginnings," Reginald toasted. Arthur nodded, his heart full, and to old promises kept. Later, as the celebration wound down, Arthur slipped away to the stables. Windsor Star greeted him with a soft nicker, the moonlight painting his coat in silver. Arthur ran his hand along the stallion's neck, remembering every hardship, every moment of doubt. "We did it, boy," he whispered, voice cracking. "We really did it." Windsor Star leaned into his touch, eyes half closed. Arthur pressed his forehead to the horses, letting the warmth flow between them, a silent exchange of gratitude and trust. Outside, the manor stood alive with light, its windows glowing like beacons against the dark. For the first time in decades, Arthur felt that Ashdown was truly his again, not because of a piece of paper, but because he had faced his enemies, made peace with the past, and found his place in the tapestry of his own story. He sat in the hay beside Windsor Star, exhausted but content, listening to the soft sounds of the horse settling in for the night. The burdens he carried were lighter now, his heart steadier. He understood, finally, that legacy was not just a matter of land or bloodline, but of courage, forgiveness, and the willingness to start again, even after a lifetime of loss. As dawn crept over the fields, Arthur rose, stretching stiff muscles. He knew there would be challenges ahead. There always were. But he felt ready for them. He walked outside, the cool air sharp with promise. George waved from the porch, the two sharing a quiet look that said more than words ever could. And in that quiet moment, as the first light gilded the stone walls of Ashdown, Arthur knew that whatever came next, he would meet it with the same quiet strength that had brought him home, and with the love of land, of horse, of family, that no power on earth could ever take away. The days following the court victory dawned fresh and cool at Ashdown Manor, but beneath the calm, Arthur sensed unfinished business. The villagers had returned to their routines, and the papers soon turned their attention to other scandals, but one ghost still lingered: Edward Fairfax. The young man's pride, battered but not broken, haunted the edges of Arthur's peace like the last remnants of a fading storm. Arthur found himself thinking about Edward often. He saw flashes of him in the determined stride of Windsor Star, in the way ambition sometimes twisted youth into arrogance. Arthur knew what it was to lose everything, and he recognized, now more than ever, the cost of letting pain curdle into bitterness. The chance for closure hung in the air, unfinished and urgent. It was no surprise, then, when Edward appeared at Ashdown's gate late one afternoon. The sky was streaked with gold and indigo, the last warmth of the day lingering on the stones. Arthur was tending the garden near the drive, trimming back wild roses that had grown unruly. He looked up as the younger man approached, his figure tense, hands jammed deep in the pockets of his tailored coat. Edward stopped a few feet away, head bowed. For a long moment neither spoke. The wind rustled through the hedges, carrying the scent of earth and memory. Arthur broke the silence, his voice gentle. "You're not here to fight, are you, Edward?" Edward shook his head, his gaze fixed on the gravel at his feet. "No. I'm tired of fighting. I needed to understand." Arthur set down his shears, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Understand what?" Edward hesitated, words coming slowly. "Why did you do all this? Why not just walk away? You had nothing left. My father made sure of that. And still, you came back. You fought for this place, for that horse, for a legacy that, if I'm honest, I never really understood." Arthur considered the question, feeling its weight. He leaned on the garden gate, looking out over the fields washed in sunset light. "Because some things matter, Edward. Not just land or money, memory, promise, love. When you have nothing left, you find out what's truly yours and what's worth reclaiming." Edward looked up at last, pain and regret warring in his eyes. "I didn't know the whole story. I just heard what my father told me. He made you out to be a villain, an old man clinging to a lost dream." Arthur nodded, understanding more than he could say. "Sometimes we inherit battles that aren't ours to fight. Your father and we both made mistakes. But hating each other never brought back what we lost." Edward let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. I truly am. I let anger and pride blind me. All I wanted was to live up to his name. But now, all I feel is empty." Arthur stepped closer, his tone soft but unwavering. "Legacy isn't just what you inherit, Edward. It's what you choose to build from what's left behind. You have a chance to start again, clean, to do something good with what you've been given." For the first time, Edward seemed smaller, stripped of all pretense. "And you? What now?" Arthur smiled, glancing toward the paddock where Windsor Star grazed, sunlight shimmering on his sleek coat. "Now I tend to what's mine. I honor the past, but I don't live in it anymore. Ashdown is more than a house. It's a place where hope can take root again." A silence fell between them, not heavy, but thoughtful. Edward nodded slowly, a measure of peace settling over his features. "Maybe I'll come back. Not to claim anything, just to see what you've built." "You'd be welcome," Arthur replied. "Anyone with an open heart is welcome here." Edward offered a tentative smile, then turned and walked back down the drive. Shoulders lighter, the burden of old anger finally set down. Arthur watched him go, feeling a strange sense of relief, like a storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. Later that evening, as dusk folded over Ashdown and the lanterns flickered on in the windows, Arthur sat in the stable beside Windsor Star. The great stallion nuzzled his shoulder, eyes gentle and wise. Arthur let his hand rest on the horse's warm neck, contentment settling deep in his bones. He thought of all that had passed, the battles won and lost, the forgiveness offered and received. There was no perfect ending, no erasure of sorrow, but there was peace, and the hope that, given time, old wounds could heal, and new stories could be written on ground reclaimed not just with stubbornness, but with love. In the stillness, Arthur closed his eyes, listening to the soft sounds of Ashdown at night, the distant laughter of neighbors, the rustle of hay, the steady breath of Windsor Star. For the first time in years, he was not waiting for the other shoe to drop. He was simply, quietly, at home. The sun crested low over the rolling hills as Arthur woke before dawn, the world outside his window veiled in silvery mist. For the first time in a long while, his dreams had been free of courtrooms and angry voices. Instead, he dreamt of open fields, the wind on his face, and the comforting presence of horses moving quietly in the morning light. He dressed in silence, pulling on boots that felt newly broken in, and stepped out into the cool air. The countryside was still, except for the distant bleating of sheep and the cheerful calls of birds greeting the day. Down at the stable, George was already at work, whistling softly as he refilled Windsor Star's water bucket. Arthur greeted him with a quiet nod. "Can't sleep either, can you, George?" George chuckled, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Some mornings are too good to waste in bed. Thought we might give Windsor Star a walk around the grounds. Let him really taste home again." Arthur smiled, the warmth of the moment easing the last knots of tension from his chest. He moved to the stall, where Windsor Star greeted him with an eager nicker, pushing his velvet nose into Arthur's palm. There was an unspoken excitement in the horse's eyes, a restlessness that spoke of remembered freedom, of heritage calling him back to the place he belonged. They led the stallion out together, his hooves ringing lightly on the old cobbles as they made their way down the drive and into the wide green pasture beyond the manor house. The mist was just lifting, unveiling the familiar rise and fall of Ashdown's fields, the hedgerows budding with summer's promise. Arthur paused at the old wooden gate, opening it with a satisfying creak. Windsor Star stepped forward, pausing only for a heartbeat, then broke into a graceful canter, mane flying, legs stretching in an effortless run. The stallion's dark form cut through the dawn, his every movement a celebration of returning life and unbroken lineage. George watched with quiet awe. "Looks like Queen's Grace, doesn't he?" Arthur nodded, a lump in his throat. "She'd be proud. I think she always knew he'd find his way home." They walked together along the edge of the field, watching Windsor Star explore every corner, rolling in the dew, nipping playfully at the grass, pausing now and then to look back at Arthur with a wild, grateful joy. It wasn't just Windsor Star who was returning home. All around, the village was waking up to the news of Ashdown's restoration. Neighbors stopped by the gate to wave. Bringing fresh bread or kind words, children gathered at the fence, laughing and calling out, wide-eyed at the sight of the legendary horse running free once more. Arthur felt their hope and happiness mingle with his own. For so long he had thought of Ashdown only as a place of loss, but now it was a place of possibility, of healing and a future. Every stone, every leaf, every morning sunbeam seemed to whisper, "Welcome back. You belong." By midday, the air was bright and warm, and Arthur sat with George under the ancient oak that marked the edge of the oldest pasture. They shared a simple lunch: cheese, apples, strong tea. Windsor Star grazed nearby, every so often wandering over for a gentle pat or a scratch behind the ears. Arthur gazed out at the land, his heart light. "We made it, George. After everything, we're really here." George grinned. "Told you we would. You just needed to believe in yourself as much as we all believed in you." For the rest of the afternoon, Arthur wandered the grounds, greeting workers and villagers, listening to their stories and hopes. He found himself promising riding lessons for the children, talking of plans to open Ashdown stables to the community, to make it a place where everyone was welcome, where the old wounds could heal and new memories could be made. As the sun dipped low once more, Arthur returned to the stable. Windsor Star met him at the gate, pressing his forehead against Arthur's chest in a quiet gesture of trust. Arthur closed his eyes, running his hands through the horse's mane, and allowed himself to simply breathe. He thought of all he had lost, all he had regained, and all that still waited ahead. There would always be work, and there would always be challenges. But as long as he had Ashdown, Windsor Star, and the people who stood by him, Arthur knew that he had everything he needed. As darkness gathered and the first stars blinked awake above the manor, Arthur stood by the open stable door, watching Windsor Star settle in for the night. The past was finally at peace, and the future, for the first time, felt wide open, like the rolling fields of home, waiting for new stories to unfold. A golden evening washed over Ashdown Manor, the sky ablaze with the kind of gentle light that softened the scars of both land and heart. Arthur stood at the edge of the paddock, hands in his pockets, as Windsor Star trotted and danced across the open field, each stride poetry in motion. The stallion's coat glimmered in the last rays of sunlight, and for a fleeting moment, Arthur saw the spirit of Queen's Grace running with him, as if the past and present had finally made peace. George lingered by the gate, watching silently. The manor house behind them glowed with life, laughter spilling from open windows, the comforting clatter of supper dishes, children's voices weaving through the cool air. Ashdown was no longer a place of empty echoes. It was alive again, stitched together by the courage to come home and the generosity to forgive. Arthur felt the weight of his years, but also their purpose. As he opened the old iron gate, Windsor Star came galloping over, snorting softly, and pressing his head against Arthur's chest. Arthur closed his eyes, resting his forehead against the horse's, feeling the warmth and steady beat of a heart so closely tied to his own journey. He spoke in a low, gentle voice. "We did it, boy. Against every odd, we brought her back. Her name, her spirit, her home." He led Windsor Star through the open gate and onto the great meadow that stretched beyond the house. The evening breeze was soft, carrying the scent of wildflowers and new grass. Arthur opened the last paddock gate wide, and Windsor Star bolted into the open, running strong and free, his mane streaming behind him like a banner of hope. Arthur watched him go, tears shining in his eyes, not of sorrow, but of deep, wordless joy. He saw Windsor Star leap and kick at the sky, as if to tell the world that the bloodline of Queen's Grace had not only survived, but triumphed. For a moment, Arthur stood completely still, letting the years slip away, the pain, the betrayals, the battles. All that remained was the sense of belonging, the peace of having finally come home. The fields, once silent, now rang with the pounding of hooves and the laughter of a new generation. He walked back to the house slowly, pausing to read the freshly painted sign on the old stone pillar. Ashdown Manor, Estimated 1823, proprietor Arthur Oldham. Inside, friends and neighbors gathered for supper, the table long and lively, filled with food and stories. George caught Arthur's eye and raised a glass, and the rest followed suit. To Arthur, to Ashdown, and to never giving up, George toasted, voice thick with emotion. Arthur smiled, his heart overflowing. To family, to friends, and to the horses who bring us home. As the evening wore on, Arthur slipped out for one last walk beneath the stars. He stood in the quiet darkness, listening to the contented sighs of Windsor Star in the stable and the distant song of night birds in the hedgerows. He thought of Queen's Grace, of all the people who had shaped his journey, and of the uncertain future, now filled with hope. He whispered into the night, words meant for every soul who had ever lost their way. There are some things money can't buy. Love, memory, legacy. They're kept only with patience and heart. And in the gentle hush, as Windsor Star whinnied softly across the meadow, Arthur knew that what he had reclaimed was more than land or victory. It was the courage to believe and the gift of belonging passed on to those who would come after him. The past was at peace, the present was bright, and the future, wide as the Ashdown fields, waited for every story yet to be told.